Okay, well, we can kick off and then the folks who join can catch up as well. All right, let's kick it off from the top again. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for being here and joining in today's session. We're going to be exploring the new world of creator and influencer marketing and how we can leverage collaborations for purpose. I'm Ashika Thacker. I'm the moderator of our panel today. I'm also an account manager with Yulu Impact Communications, specializing in influencer campaigns and collaborations. We are joining each other from various unceded Indigenous lands and territories. I would like to acknowledge that I am tuned in from the traditional and unceded lands of the Golden Hill Pasagat, Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, and Eastern Pequot peoples. If you haven't already, please share your name and where you are joining us from today in the chat. I am especially excited for today's conversation because we're going to be directly hearing from creators who are using their platforms to drive meaningful change. Their experiences will offer valuable insights on how purpose-driven storytelling, authenticity, and community engagement comes together in creator collaborations. As impact communicators, this is an opportunity for us to better understand how we can build more intentional and mutually beneficial partnerships that advance both social and creator goals. Before we introduce our special guest here today, I want to share a couple of community guidelines to set the stage for today's event. First is that we ask that you please respect the opinions of others. If opportunities do arise, please remember to critique the idea and not the person. We invite participation. We have planned time for Q&A at the end, but you're welcome throughout the session to input your comments and questions in the chat at any time. And lastly, please note that this session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. So we're looking forward to having the ability to share it there. All right. And one more last piece before we jump into sharing with our amazing guests here today. I want to briefly share about the Impact Communications Institute. So we're a registered nonprofit on a mission to use the tools of communication to drive positive, systematic change. You can find us at impactcomsinstitute.org, and you can join the pledge for responsible and ethical communications by following the link that will be posted right in the chat. All right. And without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for today. We have Tiffany Yu, CEO and founder of Diversibility, an entirely disabled-run and disabled-led social enterprise to elevate disability pride. She is also the founder of the Awesome Foundation Disability Chapter, which awards monthly microgrants to disabled projects. On top of being the author of the Anti-Ableist Manifesto and 3 times TEDx speaker, Tiffany is also a content creator with over 200,000 followers across her platforms, where she is well known for the Anti-Ableism series. We also have Fatou Berry here, founder of PR Girl Manifesto, a trailblazing platform on a mission to break barriers, amplify diverse voices, and create equitable pathways in the communications industry. She is also the director of PR and marketing for Impact 13, the foundation for NBA superstar James Harden. Thank you so much to the both of you for joining today. I'm so excited to dive into the conversation. We can jump right into questions in the spirit of time. I'm so excited to hear from you. So we'll start off with you, Tiffany, since your journey as a creator and activist really began well before the term creator or influencer was a buzzword or a tagline. How do you define activism in the social media space? How has your role evolved over time from being a community builder and an advocate to now someone who shapes mainstream media and conversations through content as an influencer?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me here. So I guess I'll start by saying I see myself as a community builder first, and then I guess an advocate second, and a creator third. And for me, I really think the springboard to becoming a creator, I actually sometimes joke, I received a sweatshirt from TikTok that said creator on the side. And I said, oh, since they sent me the sweatshirt, maybe I am a creator now. So it did take me a little bit of time to start identifying as a creator. But ultimately, part of why I started showing up on social media was in 2020, at the beginning of this current pandemic. I was so used to hosting in-person events. And when we couldn't do that anymore, one of the things I've learned as a disabled person is we pivot and we adapt and we think of creative, other innovative ways that we can navigate. And so I said, I still want to build community. I still want to figure out a way that I can continue my advocacy. Maybe there's a way that I can do that through social media platforms. And I will say, probably prior to 2020, I can probably remember off the top of my head, maybe like one or two paid brand partnership campaigns that I had participated in. So I really wasn't thinking about my platforms in terms of a way that could really significantly and meaningfully contribute to my livelihood. But what I ended up finding happening when I started sharing more of my advocacy on social media was that 15 years ago, when I started my work, if I reached 30 people or if we had 30 people come to an event, I would feel really excited. And then, I still remember my first piece of viral content. I think it was July of 2020, and it hit like 7 million. And I could have never imagined that anything that I was saying would reach millions of people. And the ways that the algorithm was set up was that it also gave me a chance to reach people I never thought I could reach, right? I had lived in these large metropolitan cities, I was building community there, but I wasn't really leveraging kind of like the power of the algorithms or hashtags to be able to find and reach new people as well. So if I kind of look back at the past 5 years, I guess, I look at this desire to want to expand my advocacy. That was kind of the beginning. And it's the same messages now done through a virtual format and in a little bit and in a different creative way. And at the same time, I think it's unlocked a lot of other opportunities for me too, including the fact that this anti-ableism series that I started in 2020 ultimately became the inspiration for a book deal that I received a couple years later, which is now this book that's out in the world called the Anti-Ableist Manifesto. So I kind of think about advocacy overall as this umbrella. And again, I tell people there's no one way to be an advocate. You can show up at City Hall, maybe you're writing letters to elected officials, maybe you're working at nonprofits like many of you who may be joining us on this call. And at the same time, people digest content in different ways too. So you'll meet people who are not active on social media at all, totally fine. You'll meet people who love reading books. Maybe there are people who don't enjoy digesting content in that way. So I kind of just see it as, how can I find as many creative outlets as possible to expand this message?
That is so fantastic. And I love that piece of diversifying your ability to connect with different audiences. I think the pandemic brought such an interesting time to us where it forced us to look at different avenues. And in that, we see years later now, we're able to connect with so many different people in so many different ways. And social media is definitely an avenue for that. So that is such an interesting thing for me. And Fatu, with your work with PR Girl Manifesto and Impact 13, you're often more so behind the scenes of the narratives that have been created in this digital world now. How have you seen the role of content creators evolve in the nonprofit and advocacy campaigns, especially when it comes to this piece around trust and community building in a very authentic way?
For sure. Well, first, thank you to ICI for having me. It's something that I've actually watched evolve really closely over the last few years. I think we have moved beyond this era of creators just being used to amplify a message or a campaign in comms. And I found that the campaigns that really resonate and the creators that really resonate in the nonprofit and advocacy space are the ones who already have deep trust with their communities, right? And it's trust that's not transactional, it's trust that's been earned. So in my work at both PR Girl Manifesto and Impact 13, I've seen that the most impactful partnerships are usually built around shared purpose, not like just shared content. So they're not just influencers. We're not just using influencers to show up and represent a cause. They really are helping to shape the narrative itself. They're partners. And what I have found is that when that happens, the work hits differently, right? Because the audience doesn't feel like they're being talked at. They feel like they're being brought into the conversation. Um, I'd say a great example of that, just recently we had a support campaign that we did during the LA Altadena Pasadena wildfires, where we collaborated with a creator who wasn't just aligned on values with us in terms of trying to spread resource and awareness, but in their community involvement. And they were also already deeply involved in the community that we were trying to reach, which was Pasadena. And because of their contribution to that community that had already been existing, it didn't feel like a performance. It felt more of like a continuation of conversations and work that they were already leading. And what I found is that we got so much more like meaningful engagement both online and in real life. And it wasn't just about like I think the likes or how people received the campaign, but it moved people, right, to take action, and that resulted in more impact. What I think is exciting though that I've seen really evolve, and it's been long overdue, is that creators who identify as purpose driven are being recognized as movement builders, right, in their own right. They're not just supporting, I think, social change, they're actively helping to shape it. They're setting the tone for what advocacy looks like, I think, not only in 2025, but beyond. And as a communicator, like there's nothing I feel like I can do but respect that, because I think for us, it means we have to give creators real agency, right? So building with them, not around them, or not having them come in at the last minute and be like, here, be a soapbox for this. And I think for us, really understanding that their voice is a big part of the strategy.
That is so excellent. And I resonate with that so much because I think the term influencer or content creator sometimes can be misunderstood. And I think there's a lot of people see it as, oh, it's a billboard. It's a way for us to be able to get our message across through another voice. But in reality, these creators carry so much power in the audience that they have and in the knowledge that they carry, and especially in the social impact space where they need to be seen as a movement builder, not just an avenue to get a message out. And I think that's so valid and kind of in line with that. Tiffany, I'm curious, there's a lot of debate, and I'm sure both of you have actually heard about this in communication circle around compensation of creators, especially those who advocate for social impact. From your perspective, why do you think that it's normalized, or it's important to normalize rather, fair pay in purpose-driven campaigns, especially working with creators in historically excluded communities?
Um, Such a good question. And, I usually what I will tell people is, always ask what the budget is. And there will definitely be some campaigns or organizations you work with who do not have any. And you can decide if you have the privilege, and I do call it a privilege, to be able to take something like that on pro bono. I think it's important to have this conversation because I think for far too long, we have, I don't know, I guess, led with the message that the mission is your payment. And I don't see my purpose paying my rent and my insurance and health, my health insurance. And so um, I'm hoping that's starting to shift. I think that started from the nonprofit world and it kind of shifted over to the creative world as well, if you're working on mission driven or movement oriented type campaigns. But all of that said, and I do want to be transparent. I've done campaigns where I am paid and compensated, and I've also done ones where I feel very aligned with what they're trying to do and have decided to take those on pro bono. So when people come to me and they say, how much should I get paid? I say, I've done campaigns for $0 and I've done some for, I don't know, almost 50K, and so you just like, uh, and this is also where I think a lot of like compensation transparency and some of the platforms that have been created around where people are sharing more about how much they're getting paid for deals also highlights discrepancies between historically excluded or creators who are from the historically excluded communities and those who are not, right? And so um, part of it, I think, is like systemic. I think the gender pay gap, there's a lot of research that's been done there. If you add in additional layers of intersectionality for me, like as a woman of color, then maybe it gets even more. And then you add like, oh, I'm disabled too, and then it gets even more. So yeah, I think that's my perspective on that.
Yeah, and I really value that. And I think there is a bigger push for transparency, and it definitely has to come from both sides as well. There needs to be a certain level of understanding with nonprofits and brands on the best way to approach. And that's why I think conversations like this are so important, where we're able to hear from both sides around kind of what are creators looking for and what are agencies and nonprofits looking for as well. And kind of in line with that, Fatu, many of these nonprofits we know have limited budgets. It's just the nature of the work that we do, but we have this inherent interest in wanting to collaborate with creators in an authentic way. How do you approach compensation and equity in creator partnerships at Impact 13 more specifically, especially when resources are tight? You know both sides of it, of being a creator and also being on the back end. How do you kind of manage that?
Yeah, this is a great question because I do work across two very different nonprofit structures. At Impact, it's funded by James, right? And people often assume that because there's a high profile figure at the helm, that we must have unlimited budget. And we are more resourced than most nonprofits, and that's a privilege that I recognize and I'm grateful for. But what people don't realize is that most of that funding is intentionally allocated towards our core mission, right? Which is rebuilding and restoring community spaces across the world. So that means most of that money is going into gyms, parks, rec centers, spaces for people to gather and feel safe. So when it comes to the campaigns that like fall outside of that or that are more brand awareness driven or even creator led, it's not always where we have the bulk of our resources or where resources are prioritized. And that can create tension because we do want to collaborate, right? And we want to show up in those ways, but then we have to be intentional about where every dollar goes. And you alluded to this, but on the other hand, PR Girl Manifesto, it's a true grassroots nonprofit. Like we're building infrastructure in real time, we're steering the ship as we're building it. And so what that's given me is a really interesting outlook of seeing the full spectrum, but what's remained consistent in both of those nonprofit structures is that transparency is non-negotiable. And Tiffany mentioned this, right? If a budget is limited, we're not going to lie about that. And we do have open conversations about what value looks like because sometimes it's financial, but sometimes it's strategic, right? It's visibility or a connection to new networks. I hate leading with, we can't pay you, but because I feel like that's a red flag. I feel like there's always something to give to a partner. And especially because in this space, nonprofit and advocacy, Tiffany, you said this perfectly. I'm so glad you mentioned it. There's this belief that it's because it's for the community and it's for the greater good that the labor should be free or low paid. And I have such tension with this idea because like any type of social impact work is deeply, it's emotional, it's intellectual labor, it's cultural labor, it's physical labor, and it's demanding, right? And so we wouldn't ask that of someone else in any other industry. So I don't think we should normalize it here. So in terms of wanting to stay equitable, right? One of the things that I tend to do is just be honest, right? If we can't pay you cash, like how can we still compensate you with care and respect or access? We might be able to put a creator in the room that they're not have been available to. We might be able to give them visibility that allows for them to get more paid, partnerships, or we can be that connecting piece. So I think there's always something of value. While the preferred route or solution is always to be able to pay like financially. If that's not available, if we can't, we'll always make sure we give something, but also follow up like what can we best support you? It might not look like financial support, but it might look like connecting you to a funder that we have access to, right? It might look like putting you in a room where these folks who are interested in investing in other causes, are together. I think when you look at nonprofits and then you look at private foundation, one of the barriers is that private foundations like that it's not accessible to everyone in terms of network. And so if we can put a creator in a space to have access to that network, we find value in that. But I think the biggest thing is transparency and really, I think collaboratively defining what equity looks like for the creator when we are collaborating or partnering with them.
Can I share a quick win?
Yeah.
So a couple years ago, or I've had a manager since 2021, but a couple of years ago, I got invited to. I live in Los Angeles now, but I got invited to fly out from the West Coast to the East Coast for a campaign, and they were offering, I think it was like $2,000, and my manager was able to negotiate it to 5,000. And when I arrived for the campaign, there were a couple other people that they had invited to be part of the campaign too. And the person who was running the campaign came to me and said, Tiffany, because of you and your manager negotiating a higher rate for yourself, we actually decided to pay all of the other people who were involved in this that same rate of 5,000. And so that's also how I kind of think about and of course the organization, and it was a nonprofit who was hosting us, did have the ability to be able to do that. But I think they were aligned on that equity front as well to say, okay, if Tiffany, and my manager does take a commission too, so I didn't see that whole thing, but the pie just grows larger for everybody, right? And that's my hope, is that it's not just Tiffany who wins out of this. The organization wins because now we're all part of this campaign, and everyone else who was part of it also got paid equitably, because didn't matter the following. It was just, we're all showing up and letting this brand use our likeness and who we are. We were all like social impact leaders in one way or another. And I just thought that that was really meaningful. So I also want to let the people who are joining this know that the impact, it isn't just between you and your relationship with the creator. It's part of this broader ecosystem as well, to hopefully lift all of us up.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's so impactful. And I think that that's really the point in this, is that it's setting the precedent, and the role that we all play in setting that precedent, and supporting on both sides, on the creator side and also the nonprofit side, of how we can all collectively do better. And every time something like this happens, we all get a little bit better and we all learn. It's like we know now where the baseline is the next time. And that's where we continuously want to work toward. And I think that that's so fantastic. And I love, Fatu, I love that piece around like collaborating in finding out where the value is for the influencer, because a lot of times it is monetary and we always want to lead with it being monetary, but sometimes it's not, it can't always be. So collaborating and figuring out what exactly is the value that we can provide for you, and that value is going to look different from creator to creator. So it's great to hear that that collaboration is always continued. Now, Tiffany, this is a question for you around how you've spoken really openly and courageously around your values and your mission. It's something I really admire about what you stand for, which can sometimes make brands nervous. How do you recommend PR teams navigate the perceived reputational risk of working with creators who are very proud and authentic in their conviction around their cause?
I still try to be brand safe and aligned with who I am. And I think that shows through in everything I try to do. Like, I even look at the anti-ableism series. I've had elected officials on, I've done paid brand partnerships, I've done paid brand partnerships as part of that series with sexual wellness companies, and so for me, I mean, my cause is, I don't even know if it's a cause. My mission is just the inclusion of disabled people, as someone who is part of this community. And also, as someone who is entrenched in my community, I see how beautiful and magical and how much of a generative force and innovative and creative force we are. And I want other people to see that too. And I hope that that level of excitement kind of comes through with brands. So I don't know if I have a great answer there. Fatu is the PR girl, so maybe she has some tips there. But I think for me, I know that if working with brands and doing partnerships is something I want to do, I also want to make sure that who I am is brand safe. I don't person my content outside of social media. I'm also not cursing as well. It's just not something that I do. No shame to anyone who does that. And then one thing that's also about my brand is that learning should never be about shame. And I will share in full transparency that I know some other creators who get really involved in sometimes like calling people out and uh, shame tactics. And sometimes that works. And I've actually seen, and I do mention this in the book, moments where we have called out elected officials on things they've done that have harmed the disability community, and they have taken action, and I hope non-performative action. But actually, that person is no longer in that role, so maybe that was part of the action. And so I think there's a place for everything, and then for some of those, I guess what I would call advocacy creators, perhaps doing those types of partnerships is not something that they want to do. And so if I do have advocates in the community come to me saying, "Hey, can you help? Can you help do an audit of my platform?" I'll go through and I'll say, "Hey, here are some suggestions around how we can potentially see brands integrate into here, or you potentially partner with nonprofits that you care about, and here's why they would want to work with you." So also making sure that you have that messaging and that pitch clear as well.
Yeah, that is So valid and so fantastic to see. I think there's a definite fear, and I think that I love that you said that learning should never be about shame, and that's really the root of everything that we do in nonprofit is creating that safe space for learning. And I think that's the beauty of the digital world and the creator space is we're creating opportunity for people to learn on their own terms and at their own pace without feeling backed into a corner. And so it's really interesting to see how creators are viewing that from their perspective as well. Now,
Can I share one other anecdote? Sorry.
please no.
And hopefully these stories like help you share like real things that are happening. So I had a nonprofit come to me who kind of works in the space that I'm in. They offered me at that particular point in time the most I've ever been paid for a brand partnership. They wanted to share their mission. As I did more research into the organization, there was something that they did that was not aligned with who I was or what I believed in. And so I actually had a call with them to address it. And I said, if we decide to work together, I have to name that this is that there is this misalignment here, and here are the actions that you as an organization are taking to work toward it. Ultimately, they decided not to work with me, but I'm glad that I stood by what I believed in and at least opened up that communication to say, hey, I love the overarching mission of what you're doing, but there's just this one specific thing of the way that you're doing it that I would love to see if you're making progress to better serve the community in a more productive way. Um, and and yeah, we're both still coexisting. I think we just realized that that partnership wasn't the best for us. And if we were to partner together, I also wanted to make sure that I would name the things because I know that my audience would want to hold me accountable to that as well.
Absolutely. And I think that that trust building piece really comes in here with how we hold ourselves as creators in terms of our standards. And I think that that's such an excellent example because it shows that you as a creator are strong in your conviction, but you also are willing to work through and create solutions instead of just closing doors. You want to kind of support them and help become better. And I think that that at the end of the day, that's all we can do as creators. And I love that. I think that that's such an amazing example that I'm sure a lot of us will draw from in the future. So Fatu, I'm curious to hear from you around both PR Girl Manifesto and Impact 13. You've really committed to equity. How do you strategize creator campaigns that center marginalized voices without falling into the trap of seasonal or one-off representation? We all see this, especially around days of the month or certain celebratory months where we all kind of tense up seeing certain brands take advantage sometimes. So how do you work around that?
Yeah, this is something that I think and talk about constantly because at both PR Girl Manifesto and Impact 13, we're not just talking about representation like as a number, right, or a metric. We try to think about what it means to center people in a way that's structural and not seasonal, as you mentioned. One-off visibility, especially around Heritage Months or times of crisis, actually, in my opinion, does more harm than good when it's not grounded in real long-term investment, right? So it creates a cycle where you're only tapping in creators or you're only engaging in campaigns when it's time to talk about their identity, right? And then they're left out the room when the strategy is being developed. And that's not equity to me. I think that's just tokenism and calling it something else. And so I think with PR Go Manifesto, first, we really built a community that exists year round. If you're familiar with our work, you'll know that we're in constant conversation with our audience about these subjects through the lens of PR and comms. But also our creators are our collaborators, right? It's not just, hey, we're featuring this person. And I think that's important because when you have someone that's been in community with you, right? One, they're able to lend their voice, but you're also able to talk about things in a more natural way that doesn't feel opportunistic, like we're going to jump on this cultural heritage month. No, like we're always spotlighting and having these conversations. This is a year-round commitment to amplifying, right? It's a year-round commitment to actually making sure that the things that we say we're about, like the communities that we're saying we're trying to support, we're actually in community with. And at Impact 13, I talked about this a little bit with the compensation, but we think about like power sharing, right? So it's not just about who's in the campaign, but who's helping us to shape the story, who's getting the credit, who's getting paid at the same level, right, as their potentially non-marginalized peers. And so are we, oh, one thing I'm really cognizant about is, are we asking creators to educate while also performing? And what does that look like and how do we avoid that? I have a deep belief that representation should never be a checkbox ever. It should always be a reflection of who's already doing the work, and who's being invited to do it in a way that honors their full humanity. I hate being asked to talk about sometimes like, what is your experience as a XYZ Yeah, and it's like, yes, it's important, but like that's not just who I am. And creators should not just be amplified for the identities during a campaign. It should be a full-time commitment. And so another thing too is just like, are we staying connected with not only our creators, but the communities that they are supporting, right? Or did we just disappear after the campaign, or after the month ended? And I think this is a thing, it's a trap that a lot of like compros fall into, that I'm always encouraging to think about, because equity is long-term thinking, right? It's not fast. It means building, but building to make sure that visibility isn't the end goal, right? But it's a broader commitment to whether it be inclusion or access or shared opportunity. And so those are some of the ways we go about that work. But my biggest thing that I try to remind not only myself but our community, and the organizations that I work with, is that if a campaign only centers specific voices when it's convenient, it's not centering them at all. Like, that's just helping the org. It's just good PR. And that's not what I think a commitment to being a partner looks like.
I really, really value that perspective. And I think that there's a lot to say in nonprofits and brands, even working with creators on a long-term standpoint versus one-off campaigns. We've all seen the comms manager who flips the calendar and sees, oh crap, it's XYZ month. I have to make a campaign around this. Okay, who can we pull together to represent this specific Heritage Month? And it's it's crappy, but it happens all the time. And I think that it's a lot to say in how communicators and campaign managers plan their years and look at how they can build long-term partnerships that create opportunity in those months rather than taking those months and making opportunities of them. So I think that there's so much to say in that. That's something I feel very passionate about as well. And I think that there's a role that nonprofits play and brands play, and then also a role that content creators play in saying no in moments like that and standing up for themselves and recognizing when they're being taken advantage of. And I'm sure the both of you have, hopefully not, but maybe have experienced moments where you had to say, no, that's not the right way to take this on. All right, we have just a couple more questions before we jump into audience questions here. Tiffany, this is a question I'm really curious about. When working on a cause-based campaign, how do you define success? What does impact look like for you as a content creator? I know for me, I see it from the campaign side. I'm really curious to hear, as a creator itself, what do you define as success?
Ooh, that's a good question. I guess two things came to mind. The first was so recently I've been trying to advocate to protect Medicaid. Um, and I was able to participate or partner with a nonprofit on a paid campaign around that. But prior to that, I had already posted like maybe 4 or 5 other pieces of content around. I got to interview the former head of CMS. Anyway, it was and that was not related. But when the ad came out, no one knew. And someone was like, "Oh, that was a really great piece of content," and they were like, "Actually, this is the most comprehensive." Um, like, someone had shared it, and they were like, "This is the most comprehensive way I've seen this explained around like this bill and its impact," and that piece of feedback really helped. But I guess to that point, it was so integrated in all of my other content that no one knew it was an ad. So, so that to me is kind of like the first piece of success. I guess the second piece of success is sometimes with some of these partnerships, there is a call to action. And I do know probably for the brand or the nonprofit that we're working with, that is part of it. But I think for me, uh, I think of like the broader message and the broader mission, and I look at, okay, are people sharing this because it's educational or other things like that? But I kind of look at I do look a little bit at the engagement. And I will say for that piece that I shared around Medicaid, there actually weren't that many like comments on it, but um it was shared like more than 150 times, which to me is good. And so I also just think that okay, there's just really good, like no one has anyone to say think anything to say about this because maybe the content in itself speaks for itself. But I think even just thinking and working with the brand and the nonprofit is looking at different measures of what success might look like. Because to me, that was probably one of my more successful nonprofit partnerships because of just the amount of times it was shared. And what was interesting was when I was going over the script with the nonprofit, the part that they wanted to cut out of the script actually ended up being the most impactful for my audience. And I'm kind of glad I kept it in there because, again, it's having that trusted fee to know like this is what's going to resonate with my audience. And then also keep in mind, it's like the fifth piece of content about one particular topic that I've done over the past week. So it all kind of builds on top of each other. So yeah, I think the first is having it so integrated within my others, and then having that level of trust with the brand or the nonprofit to be flexible in what success might look like, and then trust me with the brief to be able to turn whatever their main message is and do it in a way that works best for me and my audience.
I love that. And I can't even tell you how many times we hear from creators that the pieces that we trusted them on were the pieces that performed the best. And I think that's really, it's if you're going to work with the creator, you're going to trust that they know their audience, they know what they're talking about and who they're talking to, and allowing them to do that and measuring success based on that. And something I think is so important that you said is looking at the specific piece of content and determining what success looks like for that piece of content. Because you're right, maybe there is a piece of content that says everything it needs to say, and the real measurement is in like, why are people sharing this? What does it mean that people are sharing it? For another piece of content, it's that sentiment that can get captured through comments that a lot of data driven folks don't necessarily always look at, where they look at, okay, what was the cost per metric, what did that mean, versus what did we capture in the sentiment, and what did this do, what does this change for people, what did this open up for people? And I think that we as agencies and nonprofits want to push our teams to look at the quantitative metrics as well on top of the quality. Yeah, it's great to get 100 comments, but what do those comments say? What do they mean? And especially in the digital world where a lot of things are getting automized, we're seeing AI, bots commenting. Numbers don't always mean everything anymore. Now you have to really dig into the numbers and see what they mean. So I really value your perspective on that. And the last question here before we jump into some audience questions here is for you, Fatu. We're curious, how do you measure success in creator campaigns from the nonprofit or advocacy lens, especially when your goal is culture change, not just clicks? I think that that piece is really important.
Yeah, I think success in this space, right, goes by a totally different set of metrics than we're probably used to. I think when you're looking at nonprofit and advocacy work, especially when you're working with creators, you're not just trying to drive traffic, right? You really are trying to tap into that shift of perception. You're trying to build trust and again, having people take action, right? You're moving people towards some type of long-term change. And so measuring success, for us at PRGM or Impact 13, we look at it through just multiple dimensions. So we, of course, engagement and reach is a part of it. It's a campaign, but we're also asking, did the message feel authentic to our partner's voice, right? Did their audience stay in the conversation after we launched a campaign or put up a post? And did the content spark dialogue or reflection, or was it just likes? Did it move people to take an action? And we pay attention to who's coming into the community after a campaign or a shared post or a collaboration. Are we reaching people that who've we might not have reached before, who've never engaged with us? Are we deepening relationships and not just widening them, right? Because there's a difference, again, as you mentioned, between numbers and what that IRL impact looks like. And honestly, some of the most meaningful feedback isn't the quantitative stuff, right? It's the stuff that's more qualitative, like someone reaching out and saying like, I finally saw myself in this, or someone coming to us and they've gone to an event because they saw a partner post about it or invest in our mission. And I think even farther than that, might be an internal stakeholder saying, this really helped me understand XYZ in a new way. And that kind of feedback isn't always like easy to measure, but it does. I think it's a good tell and it's a good benchmark that the work is landing. And I also think it's important to ask the creators themselves, like, what does success look like for you in this collaboration? Because again, this idea of partnership and not just using a creator, then a creator is not an end to a means, right? Or means to an end, my bad. But like, you know, what do you want your audience to walk away with? Because it's a partnership, it should be collaborative. And I think being aligned with your creators and your partners really helps ensure that we're measuring something that matters to both of us and not just something that looks good. And so I think as those of us in advocacy and social impact know, the goal is rarely overnight behavior change. It'd be so great if that happened, but that doesn't typically happen. But it's about seeding ideas, right? And reframing the conversations that we're having and being able to create moments that ripple over time. So I think in terms of like measuring success, don't just measure visibility, but like velocity. So what momentum did this spark, right? How can we build from that? Long after this piece of content has ended, long after this post has gone up, because ROI isn't always going to be immediate, but it doesn't make it any less valuable. And as PR and comms people, I think we should like very much double down on that, whether it be to partners, stakeholders, that the ROI, again, equity is a long-term investment. Most social impact and nonprofit work is a long-term investment. So the ROI won't always be right, like the next day, but it still makes it valuable if it takes time to see it come in.
I absolutely love that. And I love the concept that KPIs are something that should be collaborative in this space rather than this is our campaign. Our goal is to have 1 million impressions. What, like, we have to work together with the creators because it's not just a mouthpiece, you know? And I love that. I think that that's such a critical piece and point. And you have to be comfortable with changing your KPIs as well. If they're not resonating, if halfway down, you have to be comfortable with the discomfort of being like, we were wrong. That actually is not how success looks, and being able to capture that. And I think on the agency side as well, of constantly looking for opportunities of how we can capture the sentiment and make that a piece that is an important KPI of what is the overall goal of the sentiment. What is the movement? What's the momentum that we want to create? What does success look like for that? So I absolutely love that. Thank you so much for sharing. Now, we have a couple of really great audience questions. In the interest of time, maybe we'll just do one and have both perspectives. I think this one is going to be really valuable to hear from both of you. And that's the question of, for PR professionals trying to engage creators from underrepresented communities, what does a respectful, non-extractive outreach look like? Maybe Tiffany, you can go first for this one.
I think one of the things that we're talking a lot about in the disability community right now is how do we make space for both the struggle of existing in an ableist society and our joy. And so for me, a non-extractive process would be, yes, pull me in for campaigns, but also I want to be invited to your celebrations. You know, if the nonprofit or the brand you're working with is hosting events too, right? And I will say I have noticed that um, there are some brands that I've worked with where they'll like invite me to go do some like advocacy, be part of like a big advocacy thing for them. And then they'll host something during API Heritage Month, you know, and I'm Asian too, but I don't get invited to that. And so it's like, oh, there's this disconnect here where you're extracting labor from me, but you're not also including me in the celebration and joy. And that's also something I want to the reason why we're talking about this within our community is there are a lot of other disabled creators who are like, oh, we only notice that we get engagement when we're sharing like how tough things are and our struggles. But I also want to showcase like elevating culture and joy and being in community and pride. And how do we make space for both of those and brands and nonprofits to see that we're not just this one single narrative of things are tough. And I also don't want to diminish that as well, right? So joy, struggle, coexisting together. I want to be part and privy to all of the things so that I have the agency to decide how we can build this relationship and partnership together over the long term.
Yeah, I'll hop in. So I think for me, the biggest thing is like for as someone who is on the PR and comms side to other PR and comms people, it's like start by doing your homework, right? I think the biggest sign of respect, one, is taking the time to understand and taking the time to commit, right? I think sometimes in the pursuit of efficiency, right? I see folks who are sending messages that are clearly copy and pasted, that are very transactional or just completely disconnected. And that signals a lack of care. I know we talked about KPIs. Care is one of my biggest KPIs in anything that I do. And so I think taking the time to learn about a creator, knowing what they stand for, how they engage their community, and whether your mission generally aligns is so important, right? We preach all the time about media relations and outreach, build relationships, know who you're pitching to, know who your journalist is. Like use that same level of care, right? When you're reaching out to a creator because they deserve that much respect, especially if somebody is advocating for something that is a lived experience. And then I think being clear and transparent, like what is the campaign? What do you need from them? Is there like as a budget, who else is involved? I think having all of that up front, having more honest conversations, like it's just respectful, but it also helps, right? Because you're building trust. And that happens before the collaboration even begins. And then I think the third thing I would recommend is don't treat access like currency. I think what I hate to see is when people look at underrepresented, underestimated creators and think that offering them visibility or networking opportunities, right, is enough. And that's why we're really big on like, I think who has the power, how do we engage, like how do we not just get people in the room because whatever that's access is whatever, but how do we make sure that we can also support the creator, right? And so I think if you're asking someone to leverage their voice in their community or their lived experience to support your campaign and your work, there should be something meaningful offered in return. And then this idea, not but this reality, and Tiffany, you touched on it, is that you don't just use them for the campaign, right? That's a transaction. Hey, do this thing for me, and then after that, I forget about you. I'm never engaging with you again, right? No, like invite them to the celebration, invite them to participate in more stuff, make space for their advocacy, but also make space for the fact that folks who are in these spaces should be celebrated and acknowledged just because. So I think at the end of the day, respectful outreach is about proximity and not performance. Are you showing up to listen, or are you just, are you making room for their input, or is it just the image, right? So I think there are a few questions that folks have to ask themselves. But if you can say yes to those things, then I think you're already doing better than most people.
I love that so much. So much of what you both said resonated so much with me. Thank you so much, Tiffany Fatu, for your taking the time to share your knowledge with us, to share your experiences with us. This has been such an insightful and impactful conversation. I really hope everybody joining feels that too, then feels like really affirm that purpose-driven collaboration is really possible when done correctly, and it can create that long-lasting change when done as a collaborator and not just the traditional way that we all see the world of collaboration. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. We hope that we will see you at our next Impact Council that'll be happening in June. If you are not already a member of the Impact Communications Institute, we highly recommend that you take the pledge on our website. We'll drop the link in the chat for responsible and ethical communications. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. We hope to see you soon.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.